Hello, good afternoon. I'm Murali. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the OII. To everyone online and in the room, welcome to this amazing lecture by Kavita, Creepy Glitches, Data, Desire, and Domestic Work. We're delighted to have Kavita, amazing friend and colleague of mine, with us today to discuss the work of feminist thinkers to take up the creepy glitch as a framework to eliminate techno-masculine normativities in data systems and to find opportunities for disruption. Kavita is a feminist researcher of digital technologies here at the OII. Broadly, Kavita's work seeks to uncover the ways in which new digital technologies are enabling particular forms of urban marginality and the potentials for overcoming these. She has conducted research on biometric technologies, gig economy work platforms, and digital dating apps. I'd just like to add that research like this, Kavita's work, is particularly significant, especially when discussing on the other side of the world, such as Oxford, kind of giving a particular flavor to that what's happening in non-Western societies, which are often ignored. So I think it's amazing that she has a space to talk about this. I'm looking forward to this and learn from her work. The presentation will run for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a discussion at the end. If you're joining online, please save your questions and we'll take them up at the later. And the same here as well. So if you have any questions, just note it down and then we can ask, we can come back, and after the talk is over, we can have a hopefully very productive discussion. And for your awareness, this event is being recorded and it will be available online and posted as well. Okay, with that, over to Kavita.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to be here and to see all of you here. And thank you, Murali, for the kind introduction. It's very nice to hear that from a good friend and colleague. So as Murali said, my talk is titled Creepy Glitches, Data, Desire, and Domestic Work. And you might be thinking at this moment, what's a creepy glitch? And I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to start a little bit more meta with a thing that we're more familiar with at the OII, which is data. And what you'll see in my talk today on my slides is that I'm going to be showcasing some of the artwork of various artists who create art in relation to gender and technologies. And I'm doing this as a practice to counter some of the new ChatGPT style AI art tools, which not only have tendencies to typecast and rely on tropes, but also are appropriating the art of various local artists. The one that you can see on the slide now is one that we commissioned by an artist in Bangalore for the Fair Work research project that I'm currently working on at the OII. So to begin then, data is all the rage at the moment. And there's a lot of scholarly and industry inquiry and concern for this thing called data. Tech industries are thriving. Generative AI is a hot topic. Data science and coders are in high demand. But what I argue here is that the question of data is fundamentally a feminist question, and the concern with data, for me, is one of a critical feminism. And what I mean by that is two things in particular, which I'm going to be talking about. Although the feminist concern with data is not just limited to these two things. So first of all, if feminism is concerned with disrupting dominating knowledges, oppressive practices, and normative systems in service of equity and justice, then critical feminist data studies is about countering the representation-centered impulses of many data sciences to show not only the ways in which data-driven systems result in the amplification of societal oppressions, but the ways in which data creates new phenomena. Data has never been a descriptive signifier that represented, for example, in colonial histories, populations, territories, memory, for example, through the census, the map, the museum. It's always been a performative technology that produced these very things. The census was part of the institutionalization of gender in many places. We as researchers create phenomena through our data collection, our analysis, and our writing. Oyurenke Oyewumi discusses in The Invention of Woman that researchers always find gender when they look for it, and how that resulted in gender becoming an organizing principle in Yoruba society in West Africa, as a result of European colonization, making gender important in Yoruba society because Yoruba life has been, and I quote, translated into English to fit the Western pattern of body reasoning, end quote. So to see data as a performative technology is to see data as always embodied, and therefore data practices as having the potential to dehumanize and having the potential for violent biopolitical implications in relation to all forms of bodily difference or embodied difference. And in digital systems of data, the consequences of data as a performative technology are ethico-political ones. And I'm referring to the work of Louisa Moore here, who says that new values are created in algorithmic systems. And so through this process of value creation, some people are included as belonging, verifiable, trustworthy, authentifiable, and others cast aside as glitchy bodies, just as one may have always existed as a glitch within the violent social systems of non-digital worlds, within our spaces that have always been coded heteronormatively. Legacy Russell draws on the glitch as an opportunity to interrupt digitally coded systems, designating the queer race body as a glitch which cannot be read as anything other than error. Russell observes how this body, which exists anyway in ways that elude the limits of coded systems, asking us to embrace the glitch as not error, but erratum, a correction to the machine. Sarah Elwood and Agnieszka Leszczynski point to the duality of the glitch as a systemic non-exception within urban techno-capital, and as materialities, aesthetics, and practices that elude the programmability of computational city paradigms. Lizzie Richardson critiques techno-capitalist narratives of the future which claim disruption and transformation, instead reorienting us to the complexities of everyday life in cities. And I'm compelled by these theorizations of the glitch as a point of critique of data systems, but also a point at which to rethink and remake data, a point of opportunity. Secondly, on why data is a feminist question, to ask this question is to counter the techno-masculinism which inheres within big data-driven systems that we see taken up, particularly through new digital technologies. And what I mean by that is that big hegemonic data systems claim to be all-knowing, all-encompassing. You can see this bigness in the amount of data, big data, but also things like tech valuations, and maybe we can extend this to the amount of funding being poured into the data sciences. But it's not just that, it's also critiques of these systems that themselves promote an overestimation of the ability of technology to transduce all spaces and times as if everything is a container waiting to be filled with capital spatial fix. And as a result, some of these narratives have neglected understandings of data beyond the vernacular of big data and take up too much the language of overestimation and theory. Macho big data regimes themselves push a form of knowledge production whereby accurate representation through categoric labels, markers, and proxies are prioritized, and this process is positioned as rational, objective, that, as Sarita Amrut and Louis Philippe Murillo say, sit in a trajectory which began with masculinist hegemonic stories of computing in the US and Europe, with things like displacing women from coding jobs and the erasure of contributions of indigenous African and Asian mathematics to techno-scientific knowledges. So data as a feminist question here is to counter techno-masculinism by illuminating the ways in which social and spatial relations constitute the digital and its data regimes. And the reason why it's important to illuminate the everyday experiences of data, of digital users, for example, is to methodologically challenge the big data machine, is because this enables us to understand the messiness of everyday life in the shadows of the categorizing, cleaning, sorting tendencies of big data systems. But it's also to leverage opportunities to disentangle these systems. And that's to say, it's not to take an all-encompassing capitalism for its word, but to take seriously and lean into the glitch of the marginality within the system in order to open up the feminist possibility of equitable futures. And so here is my point of departure to bring in two examples of what I call creepy glitches as a kind of refusal to big data technological systems that bring phenomena into being, that marginalize, and that overestimate. As you'll see in my work on digital dating apps in Mumbai, the political category of the creep emerges as a glitchy figure to keep away from the digital spaces of dating. Whilst in my work on the gig economy of domestic work in New Delhi, the glitch emerges as a creepy failure of this economy to take off, despite the odds. So my first example is what I call dateability. My PhD research puts into conversation the politics of digital technologies with the politics of sexuality in the city of Mumbai through researching the uptake and use of digital dating apps among young middle-class women and gender minorities in the city. I conducted this research through interviews as well as media analysis, and in the research I looked at 4 apps in particular, which were Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, and Truly Madly, which were some of the highest grossing apps in India at the time, which was a few years ago. I argue that dateability, how dateable individuals are on dating apps, is determined by data. This is because, as well as the technological mode of being, data also has a social life. In the last decade, while discussions have been importantly concerned with macro, big-scale data projects and processes of data abstraction, here I bring in a more intimate and grounded perspective to understandings of data. I interrogate how dating app users are engaging with, experiencing, and co-producing data on dating apps in sync with the algorithmic infrastructures that play a role in determining its flows. This provides an important vantage point from which to understand how data is implicated in and reconfigures the social. Dateability mediates what I call endogamous social intimacies. Discussions on endogamy, referring to the practice of engaging in matrimony or seeking relationships within a prescribed group in India, have been discussed along lines of caste, religion, socioeconomic class, and so on. And I propose the term endogamous social intimacies to build on discussions of endogamy from that of monogamous and heterosexual marriage relations to include non-monogamous, non-heterosexual, and not necessarily pre-marriage dating practices. This is important for this study where the purpose of dating, meeting strangers for intimate relations, was not with the intention of finding future marriage partners for any of my interlocutors. I argue that endogamous social intimacies come together with the lives of data to create a new socio-technical order of dateability. This order, I argue, is partly constituted by digital infrastructures of verification and what Lisa Nakamura has called cybertyping. The term cybertyping helps us to understand how identity online is still typed, developed from the word stereotype as the mechanical device that could reproduce images. Nakamura uses cybertype to reveal the distinctive ways that the internet, and I quote, propagates, disseminates, and commodifies images of race and racism. And I find Nakamura's concept useful here in a contemporary context in understanding the broader forms of social typing enacted through smartphone-enabled platforms such as digital dating apps. I build on Nakamura's concept here of cybertyping to understand what the acts of categorizing others based on social digital markers are. And this involves those who read the digital data identity of others, for example, on dating app profiles, through stereotyping in discriminatory ways. And I show how relationally a mode of caste and class-based cybertyping through a divide of real and fake profiles and algorithmic infrastructures of verification together create new regimes of categorization which contribute to reifying endogamous social intimacies. Since the rise of online dating globally, the phenomenon of catfishing has emerged to describe the practice of developing an intimate online relationship with someone using a fictional or an unrepresentative online persona. Some of my interlocutors developed various safeguarding mechanisms to try and avoid being catfished themselves. This involved identifying what were often called fake profiles. While these profiles were not necessarily fake, in that they existed, they were viewable, they had been constructed by a user, they were labeled in this way. The meaning of fake here was largely caste and class-based in its implication of those who do not digitally represent themselves in ways that my interlocutors found real or authentic or belonging on the dating platform. Divya, whose name I've changed, for example, echoed narratives from the majority of my interlocutors who pointed to the importance of English language in deeming others desirable and real. Reading various data attributes on a user's profile, Divya examined fakeness according to her expectation of a corresponding aesthetic and language, saying that if someone was, and I quote, exceptionally good looking, and that they didn't speak English as well as you expect them to, then that would indicate a fake profile. This was rooted in a set of social norms located, as she explained, in the back of our head to safeguard. Divya also talked about a contracted texting style where you don't use vowels, she says, how we used to type, like in 2011, locating herself in a more advanced digital future against these practices. We know that dating app algorithms provide users with potential matches based on processes of clustering data attributes, but here, Divya engages in her own process of reading and aligning data attributes on other users' profiles to identify fakeness through a set of sensibilities. The norms around how these data attributes are understood link to broader offline manifestations of caste and class-based markers, whereby certain bodies are read according to aesthetic disposition and attributed certain characteristics as correspondingly. What's digitally different here, though, is that Divya's analysis concludes with a categorization of those deemed real or those deemed fake. What I'm not arguing here is that Divya is wrong in her identification of a user's possible misrepresentation of themselves. It's common on dating apps in India to see profiles of celebrities, cars, god figures, pets, and so on. Digital safety and security are valid concerns for young people on dating apps. But what I am arguing is that the methods of identifying profiles as real or fake are rooted in a caste and class-based normativity around an expectation of aligned data attributes. This echoes the work of scholars such as Christina Dhanaraj, Ravikant Kasana, who discussed the covert ways in which dating apps reinforce oppressive caste dynamics. Kasana said in a recent article in the Swaddle, and I quote, English filtering becomes a tool of social ostracization bordering on bullying, and is often the first line of attack and a tool for excluding non-elite folks from elite social spaces. But language is not the only social barrier. Even if SC, ST, OBC people master English enough to blend in, they come to painfully realize that the Savarna dating landscape is much more complex. It's an art curation of cultural capital accrued over a lifetime of intergenerational privilege. Dating apps have also contributed to this real-fake divide through algorithmic architectures of verification, which measure verifiability in different ways. For homegrown Indian app Truly Madly, a verified digital social media presence is an important requirement for users, without which use of the app is not authorized. This requirement is framed as providing safety to women users on the app. The app requires a 5-point verification procedure. This involves cross-checking personal information through Facebook linking and validating employment history on professional networking media platform LinkedIn. It also involves validating identity information through requesting an image of a government-approved identification card, for example, passport, driver's license, or Aadhaar card, validating mobile phone number through a one-time password, and conducting a selfie verification, requesting a real-time selfie and using a facial recognition software to ensure it matches with other profile photos. A combination of these verification processes result in users being assigned a trust score. Users with a higher degree of verification, and therefore a higher score, are rewarded by being recommended to more members as a potential match. As Truly Madly explained on their website, it's kind of like getting a VIP status. The importance of online presence in this verification process is notable. Those with more social media profiles, more active social media profiles are deemed more verifiable and consequently granted higher trust scores. And this is at the heart of Truly Madly's ethos, who market themselves as an app that can keep away the creeps. Truly Madly's first advertising campaign features a Qawwali competition, a singing competition rooted in Sufi tradition between two groups of women. Each group argues that the creep they are singing about is creepier than the other group's creep. They compare their creep to a watchman, a liftman, and other service sector working class men. This framing of the creep is rooted in a highly caste and class-based discourse, isolating certain men as dangerous and unbelonging. The singers also mock the digital practices of the creep, including putting an expensive car as his WhatsApp picture or using English phrases without vowels, just like Divya did earlier. The advert ends with the text, verified profiles only on Truly Madly. The word creep was used by many of my interlocutors when discussing Tinder in particular, in addition to similar alternative words, shady, nonsense crowd, oversaturated, muddy, noisy, tacky, suspicious looking profiles, random profiles. It's notable that Tinder at the time was the platform that was one of the most accessible out of the four that I was looking at, given the limited information required to set up a profile and its light version that was available on 4G feature phones, so outside of having to need a smartphone. For many international dating apps, the algorithmic architectures of verification that claim to decipher real from fake profiles are built in US headquartered offices and are not unique to India. However, this process of deciphering reflects and continues a long history and obsession with separating Farsi and Asli, fake and real documents in the Indian state, and which continue under neoliberal regimes of transparency and accountability. Not accidentally, we see these very logics reflected in dating apps. Nainika Mathur discusses how Farsi, Asli, fake, real considerations contribute to the bureaucratic category of a doubtful citizen, a term which has gained visibility through India's bureaucratic governance initiative, the National Register of Citizens. The NRC, in collaboration with what's called the Citizen Amendment Act, determines that immigrants who regard themselves as Indian citizens must prove this through historical documentary evidence, with the exception of all but Muslims, regardless of how long they've lived in the country. Digital dating apps and their users reflect these logics by similarly enforcing and constructing a category of the doubtful data until successfully verified within the strictures of the app's verification processes. Given the limits of these processes, which rely on what apps deem real and trustworthy, this results in a technological exclusion process whereby those who cannot verify themselves are deemed fake or given lower trust scores, positioned as risky, creepy, dangerous, illegitimate, or glitchy. Here we see how the politics of desire is mediated digitally on and through the dating app. And this is important because these apps position themselves as enablers of sexual transgression, marketing themselves as revolutionizers of sexuality for young urban Indians in cities. In the making of certain digital and physical bodies as out of place through labeling them as fake, we can identify a relegation to residualities. And this occurs through what Simone Brown has called a digital epidermalization. As power is cast by the disembodied gaze of technologies, here dating apps and their undergirded algorithmic verification processes, it does the work of alienating the subject, and I quote, by producing a truth about the body and one's identity or identities, end quote. Similarly, as Mudliar discusses, people find themselves confronted with their newfound status, and I quote, as pieces of broken data, end quote. Rather than technological glitches which can be fixed, these glitchy bodies on the dating app signify systemic design features constituting part of the socio-technical order of datability. as Christina Dunaraj says, we need to have a serious discourse on the politics of desirability. And I quote, who we choose to have sex with, who we are friends with benefits with, and who we get into committed, exclusive relationships with are political choices. This cannot be downplayed as personal preference, end quote. And here we see how the politics of desirability becomes institutionalized in digital ways through data and through the dating app. My second example of the creepy glitch here is in the on-demand economy of domestic work in New Delhi. We know that the platform, gig, on-demand economy's rapid emergence in cities across the world is transforming work lives. And spearheading this movement is global on-demand service platform Uber. Uber's rapid emergence has led it to become a hallmark of success in the platform economy, with many in tech circles hoping to achieve similar success, as they describe themselves as the Uber of dog walking, babysitting, nursing, you name it. Following this trend, global think tank, the Overseas Development Institute, used the term Uberization of domestic work to describe a new emerging platform economy market, which it claimed is growing rapidly in cities across the global south, including India. That was in 2017. And this wasn't surprising, given that in India, there's been a large policy push towards digitalization paired with cheap access to smartphones and data. The gig economy was and is still growing rapidly. And India's most popular on-demand service markets are in transport and food delivery. In terms of food delivery, this also includes a startup called Swiggy, which itself claims to be becoming the largest employer in the country after the army and railways, although clearly an overestimation. And it's in this context of the rapid emergence of on-demand platforms in India that everyday home service platforms began to emerge. Some of these include MyDidi, TaskBob, Mr. Right, Urban Company, HouseJoy, Helper, Home Triangle, and more, all of which provide or provided on-demand cleaning and cooking services, with some providing a whole other array of services. In India, reports have pointed to a 60% month-on-month expansion of on-demand domestic work companies. And this was reported in the ODI report that I mentioned that came out in 2017. The visions of many of these platforms were, as one article puts it, rooted in the attempts to solve, and I quote, the perennial problem at most Indian homes, the search for a well-trained professional maid who lasts the job, end quote. The platform MyDidi, meaning elder sister, a common kinship term used to refer to domestic workers in India, is a telling example of this. Founded in 2015, the company offered on-demand cleaning and cooking services to residents of Mumbai and later other cities, including New Delhi. It was set up by 3 ex-corporate professionals from McKinsey, Credit Suisse, Wikipedia, and the company raised a total investment of almost $1 million. When I arrived in Delhi to conduct this research in 2018, I found that 2 of the country's on-demand domestic work providers, 2 of the most prominent ones that had been in the media, MyDidi and TaskBob, had both abruptly stopped providing their regular on-demand domestic work services, with one of them, TaskBob, shutting shop altogether. Other home services platforms followed this trend, relying on a broader range of home services beyond on-demand cleaning and cooking. So I kind of changed the project's questions at that time to investigate the failure and the absence of this economy, in contrast to what was anticipated by platform companies and investors. What I was doing was taking less seriously the overestimations of this sector and leaning methodologically into the everyday realities of domestic workers' lives by speaking directly to them across Delhi and its surrounding National Capital Region. And also I spoke to others who worked in the tech and domestic work sector. And in doing this, what became clear was that the feminization of the domestic work sector in India, the fact that this work is mostly conducted by women, it was kind of surprising that the term Uberization was used to take up and describe its digitization. Uberization of domestic work implies that the on-demand economy of domestic work is emulating that of transport aggregator Uber, which in India and globally uses the on-demand services predominantly of men. In other words, it assumes that women domestic workers have the same urban social lives as Uber drivers. And the idea of Uberization is reflective of a broader Uber bias in literature on the platform economy in general. But what inheres within this phrase is the techno-masculinist speculative logics that platform companies themselves champion. And that is that on-demand platforms can universally expropriate the labor of varying populations regardless of local gendered socio-spatial relations. And so in the everyday lives of domestic workers in Delhi NCR, access to digital technologies wasn't always consistent. While some women that I spoke to owned smartphones, they sometimes shared that they would share these smartphones with their husbands. Others owned what they called button phones or 4G feature phones, or no phone at all. And while many found innovative workarounds to use these English language centered or operated devices without being English language literate, by, for example, navigating to the call log function to call somebody, or using YouTube recommendations rather than using the search box. A universal idea of digital literacy assumed by platforms wouldn't work for these women. And finally, domestic workers in India often live proximate to communities in which they work, engaging in long-term relationships with employers in these communities. And this proximity means that workers can also remain proximate to their own domestic responsibilities, including things like childcare. Moving around the city to different locations also posed safety concerns, and platforms responded to this by sending transportation to pick up women. Meenakshi Jain, CEO of an online platform called Helper for You, which mediates long-term arrangements between domestic workers and clients, put workers in touch with My Didi for on-demand service work. She explained to me, when they started, they were giving the Didis auto fare to go to the place that they needed to go. But operationally, it was very costly for them. So then they said, okay, we'll send someone to pick you up on a bike. So then this biker can do multiple picks and drops. And this would be more cost effective. But for a Didi to be going on a bike with a man who's not her husband, this is not allowed in the society. The husband would raise objections and the society would raise objections. So some of the Didis that we had helped them procure from us came back to us and said, we can't do this work. Geographies of fear in urban spaces are often rooted in social perceptions of threat, which shape the mental maps that mediate everyday decisions and govern where people choose to go. That's from England and Simon. The constructs of fear and safety alter according to social and spatial positions. And for women domestic workers in Delhi NCR, the urban geographies of fear are mediated through a power-laden discourse of honor and safety, dictating their movement through the city, in this case, going on a bike with a man who's not her husband. And while this is important to note, it's also important to note here that this is not because these workers lack agency. Domestic workers in India have organized, protested, and resisted in everyday as well as countrywide labor movements, given their lack of regulatory protection, but rather it's to lean into the nuance of heteropatriarchal relations which mediate women domestic workers' urban work lives. And it's these relations which on-demand domestic work platforms failed to disentangle. Contra-generic trends of urbanization in India, which have excluded or spatially contained the urban working classes from fortified enclaves of the city, that's Teresa Caldera. Here, the platform economy of domestic work actually depends on the digital access, engagement, and inclusion of women workers in these classes. If the logic of this economy is universal appropriation of labor, then women domestic workers emerge as glitches to this logic. And more than this, the platform economy of domestic work itself emerges as a creepy glitch, assuming a neutrality that the city fails to offer. This glitch exposes the technologically utopian imaginaries of platform champions as masculinist overestimations within which inhere a temporal disjuncture from the everyday contemporary experiences of the marginal actors upon whom data-driven platform activities rely. And while this research was conducted in 2018, I also want to point to a report that I'm writing with my colleague Anjali, who's here, where we're finding very similar things across the world in different contexts. So keep your eye out for that, which is going to be coming out in the next few months. So finally, the glitch as a labeled creep in digital dating apps and the creepy glitch of the on-demand economy of domestic work together show the stakes of data-driven systems as that which both bring into being ethico-political truths, labeling people in certain ways as fake, but also the data-driven system which itself emerges as an overestimated falsehood, resulting in failure. These contradictions signify a juncture at which to think through potentials of data feminism. How can we leverage these glitches towards equitable ends? And by way of a very short conclusion, I just want to point to a text. In the Feminist Data Manifest No, which is a manifesto of refusal, refusing harmful data regimes, the authors commit to new data futures and assert that, and I quote, data can be a check-in, a story, an experience, or a set of experiences, and a resource to begin and continue dialogue. It can and should always resist reduction. Data is a thing, a process, and a relationship we make and put to use. We can make it and use it differently. End quote. Thank you.
Any questions, comments? Okay. Are there any online?
Could I ask you a question? Yeah, I don't see any input here. Could you tell us a bit more about why, like, domestic work vis-a-vis dating apps, like what led you to choose the two rather than like go any other trajectory?
Yeah, sure. So the first project that I conducted was the one on domestic work platforms. And to be completely frank about it, it was a few years, I was just starting my master's and I needed a project to focus my research on. And I was very interested in the platform economy. That's kind of been a thread through my research since then. And what I was concerned with at the time was that platform economy literature focused mostly on Uber or platforms that were similar to Uber, and definitely only on ride hailing and food delivery. And so there was the emergence of these other kinds of platforms coming up, and not much research on them. Apart from the ODI report that I mentioned, there was hardly anything at the time written on domestic work platforms. So that was where my interest led me at the time. And of course, we found that a lot of these platforms kind of went bust and are still going bust around the world. And it was actually during the time that I was in Delhi doing just this research in 2018 that I came to learn more about the emergence of digital dating apps in Indian cities, because all of my friends were on them and they were some of the highest grossing apps in the city. And we didn't know much about them from a kind of social science perspective. But what we did know is there were adverts everywhere claiming that these platforms will allow you to find love on your own terms or meet whoever you want to meet. Whereas in fact, like what I was seeing was something totally different, which it was just enabling endogamous social intimacies in different ways. So then when I was coming up with a question for my PhD, that's kind of where it led me.
So this is more of a comment, but I basically want you to reflect and help me expand on this. But it strikes me that both the dating apps and the domestic work platforms are basically offering women an opportunity to have more freedoms in a way that is extremely subversive. And it also seems the way, by using the figure of the creep in the dating apps, they can sort of legitimize this really disciplinary, like having all this data, like very invasive data, passports, LinkedIn profile, etc., from these women, so that these women act predictably. But they were never able to, the domestic platforms weren't able to make women behave predictably. Is that right? Am I missing something?
Yes, I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but so the data that is being collected from platforms like Truly Madly, the verification data, is for the purpose of creating trust scores, but obviously also a data collection for other things, you know, data capture. I think for the domestic work platforms, data capture would, of course, also be a priority for these platforms, but it's just not possible without women owning private smartphones and being able to use them. And as we see in many contexts, we were just speaking to some colleagues in Egypt the other day who said it's exactly the same in terms of women who work on domestic work platforms don't own smartphones, they own 4G feature phones. And so they need to figure out where they're going before they even leave their home and navigate their way through the city. Does that speak to your question? Or
Yeah, I think so. I think what I was trying to see if I could make the connection was, do data regimes only work if people using it behave in predictable ways as predictable data points?
right. Yeah, I think so. In terms of the domestic work platforms, one of the arguments I was trying to make was that predictability itself is masculinist, right? Because it's based on an archetypal idea of like who the platform worker is. And of course, when platforms are often, you know, led by men who haven't done enough research into what societies look like and what's going to work, it's of course then amplifying that already existing idea of the archetypal platform worker. So we see in that scenario that it results in the whole kind of economy collapsing because the economy relies on these techno-masculinist logics. But what I'm not saying is that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's more of an observation, because one of the things that we also see, especially with our research with on gender and platform work around the world, is that there are benefits to lots of women in engaging in platform work as well. So I'd rather less say, you know, a value kind of judgment statement about whether this predictability is necessarily beneficial to all workers. I think that we need to like think about that a little bit more. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Are there any question online? Can you see?
So I don't think so, but yes. Yeah, I don't think there are any. I just minimize the box, so.
One in the room.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So one of the things that like your point about the domestic platforms and like the failure of the people who've set them up to kind of recognize some of the dynamics, it's like, you know how I'm using Uber as an example, which I know is what you're kind of cautioning against, but I know that like in places like South Africa, for example, Uber like allow cash to like bring in like a wider pool of workers. So there's like a reflection on like some kind of like geographic differences and like economic differences, would you say then that it's like fair to, maybe you can't make such a generalization, but would you say it's fair to assume that like these big platforms are kind of more awake to some of the things, like some of those geographic economic things that they might need to, like alterations they might want to make to bring in a wider pool of workers, than they are to more like maybe more subtle things like gender differences? And I don't know, there are probably other examples. Is that like a fair assumption maybe?
So to clarify your question, you observe that platforms are willing to accept.
So I think there are like examples of where platforms have like made alterations to the way they kind of like do business so that they can basically bring in a wider pool of workers in places where the model doesn't, like the model, for example, here doesn't quite work. But if, you know, like the need for cash for certain people to kind of get on board, or the, I don't know, I know there are other examples. And so I just think it's like an interesting like counterpoint this, because obviously there's a complete, like, as you're showing, like lack of like alteration to account for like differences in terms of gender. So it's just like, I guess it's more of an observation than like a question, but yeah, that's like an interesting contrast.
So I think with a lot of platforms, including ride hailing and food delivery, they've always operated in cash in many places. I mean, of course not here, but like in India, for example, being able to pay in cash is fundamental to the operation of many of these ride hailing and food delivery platforms. So I don't know if it's necessarily an alteration rather than like a thing that's specifically targeted to certain markets that have, you know, that use more cash. But I would say that in terms of gender, we do see a lot of kind of tokenistic moves by platforms to include women, women workers, including things like PR campaigns and instituting policies that are, you know, somewhat friendly to women in kind of vernacular, but in practice it doesn't really result in any meaningful changes or any meaningful increases in women workers. I think it's with this particular case in India, when thinking about like what platforms could have done to include women workers, they did a lot in terms of training. Some platforms dispersed smartphones to women, but things like, you know, going to a different person's house every day, or getting on a bike with a man, or having your own domestic responsibilities at home, things like that cannot easily be kind of disrupted in a kind of technological way. And I think that's where a lot of these platforms went wrong, in that their whole model was kind of based on the logistics of moving across the city to different locations, requiring urban navigation, requiring navigating an English language interface, and requiring interacting with different people every day. And those are the particular kind of gendered things that a lot of these platforms didn't foresee.
I really like the your phrasing of endogamous social enterprises. I like that. I just have a quick few questions on that. One is, did you also come across instances where users criticized the bodies of other belonging to other caste or class? You know, it's one thing is actually following the age-old norms, but it could also provide spaces for disruption and, you know, violating existing norms. Did you come across that? And extending that question, did you see similar parallel when it comes to domestic care apps, where users are either actively supported or rejected domestic care workers on the basis of these categories? That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So I know that it is a phenomenon in Savarna culture in India, in this kind of caste culture, to fetishize people, you know, who are marginalized. It's part of the culture, and that's why this like interrogation of sexual politics is really important. I didn't come across that in my research myself, but I only spoke to about 50 people, is one thing to note. And the second thing to note is that I think it's something that they would be more hesitant to say to me. I did come across, though, people who were trying to be transgressive in their dating practices by changing some of the settings of the dating app. So I had one interlocutor who said that on Hinge, she only sees people who are Hindu because her name is Hindu, and she assumes that the app will then feed her potential matches who are Hindu. So then she changed her own religion on the platform to Muslim. And then she says, oh, now I see Muslim people on the platform, many of whom were her friends, because her GPS settings were, her search settings were, I think, something like 2 kilometers around her house. So it was all the people who she knew around her house who she was seeing. So there are these strategies to try and kind of foresee or understand how the operations of the platforms exist and work, and try and kind of combat that by changing your own settings. Again, with the platform workers, with the domestic workers, so while I didn't come across any cases of these workers experiencing kind of discrimination in terms of specific modes of social oppression, all of them talked about discrimination as an everyday kind of instance. So it was part of the work that they do, the discrimination, being asked to work beyond their hours, being asked to work and do tasks that they weren't necessarily wanting to do. For example, if they were employed as a cook or a cleaner, their employer would say, oh, now there's a bit more time, you can rub my feet, rub my back, things like that. So all of these things would come up, and it's because of the unequal power relation that we can read that as discrimination, and we can give a name to those social systems that mediate those relations. But it came up more in those ways.
Hi there, I'm just a guest visiting, but I thought that was a wonderful presentation. I had a question, maybe similar to the question 2 questions ago, about sort of market pressures. So it strikes me as interesting that the term Uberization is used to describe these, gig economy version of these kind of traditional services, because Uber, at least to my knowledge, doesn't really make a profit. It's a huge scale app, but it's not particularly successful one if you were looking at it as in terms of profit and loss. And similarly with your second examples, it seemed like following the techno-masculinist masculine logics, if that's the term you used, seems to basically have destroyed their market. And so it just strikes me that following these techno-masculine logics is not helping the bottom line, and is actually really hurting these companies in a kind of interesting way, potentially. And I'm curious whether you think there's any sort of market pressure or incentive for these companies to actually start taking a closer look at social dynamics in local regions and the gender dynamics that are at play. Because it seems like they're making some, serious economic mistakes by neglecting those things.
Yeah, good question. And I think we can find out more by kind of following the money. But as you have asserted, a lot of these large platform economy platforms are non-profitable and run off speculative finance, which is why I'm not sure whether failures like this actually do hurt them, because I mean, for these three entrepreneurs who created MyVivi, which went bust, I think, of course, it's not like they're then relying on other parts of the platform's services that they can then turn to. But when startups have this kind of culture of investment and speculative finance, I think apart from the investors, I don't know where the incentive is to actually try and understand markets in a nuanced way. And what we see happening is that the bigger platforms are growing and that other platforms are emerging in those markets specifically because those are the markets with the most demand and with the most supply of workers, which then leads us to ask, like, what does this mean on a larger scale for global cities around the world when certain workers, men, are running the platform economy, essentially? What does that mean for gender dynamics globally, right? And I think that's the question that we're coming to as the platform economy continues to expand, continues to take up more and more and more workers, and continues to leave out other workers. And it's important to say as well that it does, I mean, informal worker arrangements are still going to continue to exist for women domestic workers, right? So unregulated informal workers, relationships between clients and workers are made outside of regulation, outside of the purview of platforms. And so there is this kind of left behind narrative as well of like which workers are the archetypal platform workers and which workers are the most profitable. And what do these failures mean for gender dynamics as a result of who we're seeing as left behind?